The sky was calm, until it wasn't. At 10,000 feet, Flight 747 lost all control. The captain was unconscious. The co-pilot, frozen in panic. Just when all seemed lost, a blonde flight attendant, Lily Morgan, stepped into the cockpit and did the unthinkable. What unfolds next is a story of instinct, courage, and a partnership born from chaos. As systems failed and hope dimmed, she guided the young co-pilot Kevin Blake through the impossible, stabilizing a doomed aircraft with nothing but knowledge, calm, and heart. But after the miracle landing came something no one expected: judgment, blame, and a public storm that threatened to tear it all apart. Yet, out of that turbulence, something quiet and enduring began to take shape: connection, trust, and a love neither of them saw coming. So now, turn off the lights, set your fan to low, let your body relax. This isn't just a flight story, it's a journey. Listen until the end, and if it moves you even a little, leave a 0 to 10 in the comments. Who really saved that plane? And what did it awaken in the hearts of two strangers? Let's find out. The sun had begun its descent, casting golden streaks over the clouds as Flight 747 cruised steadily through the late afternoon sky. Inside the cockpit, co-pilot Kevin Blake sat at the controls, humming faintly to himself, eyes flicking across the instrument panel in habitual rhythm. Captain Douglas Hart, seasoned and stoic, leaned back in his seat, sipping lukewarm coffee as they exchanged quiet banter about weekend plans and weather turbulence over the Rockies. It was routine, predictable, safe, until it wasn't. A sudden jolt, sharp, unnatural, shook the plane from nose to tail. Alarms erupted, red lights flashed. The autopilot disengaged with a deafening chime that pierced the air like a scream. Kevin's fingers tensed around the yoke as the aircraft dipped slightly, then abruptly rolled. Captain Hart's cup flew from his hand, sloshing coffee across the console. But what truly stole the breath from Kevin's lungs was the sound of the captain's head striking the bulkhead behind him. Hard, final. "Captain!" Kevin called out, voice already cracking under pressure. He reached over, shaking Douglas by the shoulder, but the man was slumped lifelessly, a thin trail of blood curving from his temple down the edge of his jaw. The co-pilot's heart thundered as another shudder rocked the fuselage, and outside the windshield, clouds darkened rapidly, swallowing the horizon. Inside the cockpit, chaos reigned. Electrical flickers rippled across the displays. Warnings piled on warnings. Hydraulics failure, autopilot offline, stabilizer control erratic. "Tower, this is Flight 747. Mayday, mayday. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit. The captain is down. Flight control is compromised. Request immediate instructions." The headset crackled, then fell silent. A lag Kevin hadn't anticipated, but somehow feared. The aircraft banked to the left without input, and Kevin, still gripping the yoke, pulled hard to stabilize it, sweat beading along his brow as gravity pressed against his spine. Behind the sealed door, the murmur of confusion had begun to rise in the cabin. He didn't need a camera to see it. He could feel it in the air, that collective shift from curiosity to fear. Desperate to regain order, Kevin toggled the manual override, praying the controls would respond. But the yoke fought him with a stiff, uncooperative resistance. Everything he had rehearsed in the simulator felt suddenly flimsy, incomplete. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, flicking switches, overriding warnings, mentally scanning emergency protocols that now blurred together in his mind. The altimeter needle spiraled downward, 10,000 feet and falling. Behind the thin barrier of the cockpit door, a cry pierced through. A child's voice, followed by the hiss of oxygen masks deploying. The jet's internal pressure had dropped just slightly, but enough to trip systems and raise panic. Kevin stared at the screen, his reflection in the dark monitor glass pale and hollow-eyed. He had flown through storms, through unexpected turbulence, but nothing had prepared him for this, the crushing weight of responsibility, alone in a failing aircraft. Then came the knock. Not loud, not frantic, just certain. Kevin turned, half expecting a crew member demanding answers, but the cockpit door creaked open before he could speak. Standing in the threshold, framed by the dimmed emergency lights of the cabin, was Lily Morgan. Blonde hair pulled back tightly, cheeks flushed not from fear, but from urgency. Her uniform slightly wrinkled, yet her posture was solid, unshaken. "The captain's unconscious," she said, her voice measured. "You're in over your head." Kevin blinked, startled. "Excuse me?" She stepped inside, steady as a surgeon. "I've studied these systems. I've trained on commercial-grade simulators, more than most cadets get. I know what's wrong, and I can help." Kevin let out a humorless laugh, masking the tremble in his chest. "You're a flight attendant. And you're about to lose altitude control if you don't reduce throttle by 40% and reset the secondary stabilizer input, now." Her words sliced through the rising panic like a blade. Kevin hesitated for a fraction of a second, torn between protocol and survival. But the aircraft gave another ominous lurch, and something in her tone, unshaken, almost surgical, made him move. He stepped aside slightly. "Show me." She leaned forward with surprising precision, her fingers navigating the overhead switches, her eyes scanning the panels like a second nature. "Manual control's not enough. You've lost pressure in the auxiliary hydraulic lines. We have to reroute control to the backup regulator," she pointed. "There, and set flaps to 12. We can't afford a full sweep yet." Kevin followed, hands moving with renewed focus under her command. He didn't understand how or why she knew, but the plane was responding. Slowly, but enough to breathe. Minutes passed, altitude steadied, the incline evened out. Kevin stole a glance at Lily, who now stood at his side, arms crossed, assessing the displays with sharp, calculating calm. "How the hell do you know all this?" he asked. Her answer was simple. "I used to build simulators before I became a flight attendant. My brother's an engineer at AvioCorps. This cockpit? I've practically lived inside its digital twin." Kevin looked at her fully for the first time, not just as the stranger who walked through the door, but the person who might keep them from falling out of the sky. "Okay then," he said, voice steadying. "Let's land this bird." Outside the windows, the clouds thickened like a warning, but inside the cockpit, two unlikely allies had just taken back control. And deep in the cabin, beyond the curtain and chaos, no one yet knew that the quiet woman with the golden hair was the only thing standing between them and oblivion. The cockpit had never felt this claustrophobic. Though the altitude was stabilizing and the plane had ceased its violent swaying, Kevin's heartbeat refused to slow, and sweat still clung to the back of his neck. The flashing warnings had softened to steady glows, persistent, but no longer screaming. Yet the presence beside him was more unsettling than the storm itself. Lily Morgan, still standing tall and poised, had not asked for permission. She had simply stepped forward and taken control, not with arrogance, but with an unnerving sense of purpose. And despite every rule, every ingrained response that told Kevin she didn't belong in the cockpit, something deeper, primal, almost instinctive, kept him from pushing her out. Because the truth, however uncomfortable, was undeniable. Without her, the plane might already be lost. Kevin adjusted the flaps, as she'd instructed, and the aircraft responded with a subtle shift, smoother than before, like a wild animal finally responding to a calm voice. Lily watched the instruments without flinching, hands clasped behind her back, as if she were on the bridge of a ship she'd captained 1,000 times. "You shouldn't be here," Kevin muttered, more to himself than to her. "I know," Lily replied evenly. But you needed help, and I'm not good at watching people crash when I know how to stop it. Kevin glanced at her sideways, studying the way her eyes stayed locked on the systems, the flicker of calculation behind them. Flight attendants are supposed to calm passengers and serve drinks, not reroute avionics mid-flight. She didn't even blink. And co-pilots aren't supposed to freeze up under pressure, but we're all off script today, aren't we? Her words stung, though not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Kevin exhaled slowly, grounding himself in the shifting reality of the moment. So you've trained on this model before? He asked. Flight Sim 3200. My brother designed part of the logic code. I built a private rig from surplus panels and spent 3 years testing every failure scenario the FAA had published. She paused, turning to him for the first time. What we experiencing now? It's rare, but it's not new, and it's not impossible. Her voice held no bravado, no hunger for validation, just quiet certainty. It was the kind of certainty Kevin needed more than pride. He returned his attention to the monitors, cross-checking her recommendations with what training and instinct told him. So far, everything checked out. The altimeter showed they'd held at 8,300 feet for nearly 2 minutes, a plateau after the terrifying plunge. Outside, clouds still loomed, but the storm's grip seemed looser now, as if sensing its victims had clawed back some control. We're diverting to the nearest military airstrip. I need you to help monitor the descent path, Kevin said, without hesitation this time. Lily nodded once. Already pulled up the emergency nav charts from memory. You'll have visual in under 5 minutes if we maintain current heading. He blinked, impressed despite himself. You memorize emergency military runways? I memorize everything, she said. Especially the parts no one else bothers to read. Below them, the cabin remained unaware of the full picture. Oxygen masks still hung like limp ghosts from the ceiling, and passengers, though quieter now, shifted restlessly in their seats. A few had begun whispering that something had changed, that they were flying smoother, that someone must have gotten through. But no one imagined the person steadying the plane was the woman who had handed out water and peanuts just an hour ago. Lily moved to the auxiliary panel, scanning the emergency fuel system, checking for irregularities, then recalibrating cabin pressure with practiced ease. The backup pressurization is holding, she noted. We'll be fine for another 30 minutes if needed. Kevin tilted his head, watching her again. Not the way a man watches a woman, but the way a pilot studies another pilot. Noticed how she braced herself instinctively with every minor jolt, how her eyes never lingered on a single reading longer than needed, how she never once hesitated. You ever regret not flying officially? He asked, partly to fill the tension, partly out of genuine curiosity. Lily's lips twitched at the corner, an almost smile. Once. Then I remembered how politics and egos work in cockpits. She met his gaze briefly. I never wanted the stripes. I wanted the knowledge, and today, that's enough. Kevin didn't respond, but something shifted inside him. She wasn't here for glory or recognition. She was here because she couldn't stand still while others were in danger. And that, perhaps, made her more of a pilot than most he'd flown with. The intercom hissed with life. A scratchy voice from the tower broke through. Flight 747. Confirm you've regained partial control. Do you need a ground escort? Kevin reached for the mic, pausing. We're stable for now. Requesting emergency landing at Base Alpha 4. Co-pilot is in control with assistance. He glanced at Lily. Unexpected assistance. There was a beat of silence. Then, copy that, 747. The runway is being cleared. Maintain the current vector. Winds are light at 3 knots. We'll see you soon. Kevin let go of the mic and leaned back for the first time since the captain went down. Well, Lily Morgan, this isn't what I thought today would be. Lily chuckled softly, Her first real laugh, low and tired. Neither did I, Kevin, but maybe that's the point. No one expects the storm, but someone always has to fly through it. And as the sky began to thin just slightly, revealing slivers of sunlight like hope breaking through the cracks, Kevin realized something profound. The woman beside him hadn't just walked into the cockpit. She had walked into the storm, uninvited and unshaken. And somehow, she belonged there. For the first time in over 20 minutes, Kevin no longer felt like he was alone inside a metal coffin hurtling toward the ground. The cockpit, while still filled with the soft hum of warning indicators and the occasional flicker of caution lights, had settled into a strange sort of rhythm. Lily had taken the co-pilot seat without being asked, her legs crossed, headset adjusted, fingers dancing over the console with fluid familiarity. Kevin didn't stop her. Not anymore. There was something in the way she moved, calm but intentional, that made it feel like she belonged there all along. Outside, thick clouds still obscured any view of the terrain below, but the altimeter held steady at 7,900 feet. It wasn't perfect, but it was a long way from a death spiral. Kevin double-checked the emergency transponder and then took a slow breath, trying to center himself in the moment. "How's your visual sense?" he asked, eyes flicking to the radar that showed a faint but promising break ahead in the cloud cover. Lily leaned forward, scanning the instrument panel before answering. "I'd say we've got 3 minutes before we breach cloud ceiling. That gives us maybe 5 more before visual confirmation of the strip, assuming the tower didn't screw up the coordinate relay." Kevin smirked, despite the tension. "You really don't like towers, do you?" She didn't look at him, but he could hear the smile in her voice. "Only when they treat pilots like idiots, or when they ask useless questions while we're trying not to die." The plane banked slightly to the right, smoother this time, as Kevin adjusted based on Lily's recalculated vector. He was no longer hesitating when she gave instructions. She didn't bark at them like a commander. She offered them like a teammate who had no time for pride. And that made all the difference. The odd thing was, he wasn't just surviving this with her. He was learning. He was absorbing the way she thought, the way she anticipated problems before they appeared, the way she never let fear cloud her technical judgment. Kevin had trained for years with instructors, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd flown with someone who made him feel sharper just by being there. Down below, the passengers remained mostly in the dark about what was happening in the cockpit, though the smoother flight path had eased their panic. The masks still hung, unused now, and the cries had faded into nervous murmurs. A few passengers glanced toward the front of the cabin, where the cockpit door had been cracked open for a moment too long earlier, just enough for one or two to catch a glimpse of Lily in the right-hand seat. There had been confusion. Wasn't she a flight attendant? Was she flying the plane? The whispers swelled, but no one dared get up to ask. Instead, the entire cabin waited, suspended in fear and a desperate kind of hope that whoever was up front knew what they were doing. In the cockpit, Lily's voice cut through the relative calm. "Check left aileron control again. We're getting minor drift." Kevin complied, feeling the slight tug as the plane corrected its course. "Stabilized," he said. "We're holding clean at 7,600. You were right." She didn't gloat. She didn't even acknowledge the compliment. She just moved to the next step. "Once we breach clouds, we'll need to identify the approach pattern immediately. This strip's short and narrow military design. You miss your mark, there's no go-around, only terrain." Kevin nodded grimly. "Copy that. I'll handle the landing, but I want your eyes on the ground as soon as we get visual." She tilted her head toward him just slightly. "You sure you want to handle it?" "I've done this simulation at least," Kevin cut her off gently. "You've been flying for the past 20 minutes. It's time I remember how to do my job. But I want you with me. Every step." There was a beat of silence, filled only by the drone of the engines and the occasional creak of the fuselage. Then Lily nodded once. Fair deal. And with that, they were a team. Not by rank or title, but by necessity, by choice, by the invisible thread that sometimes connects two people who never expected to need each other, but find themselves exactly where they're meant to be. The cockpit didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like a cockpit should. A place of focus, of strategy, of mutual respect. Ahead, the clouds began to break. Pale sunlight slashed through the mist like a blade, revealing glimpses of forested hills and, finally, a narrow stretch of gray concrete far below. Kevin gripped the yoke more firmly, adjusting pitch and altitude with practiced motion. There it is, he said. Runway in sight, about damn time. Lily leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. Wind looks stable. We're drifting a hair to the east. Correction, 3 degrees left. Kevin adjusted without question. Roger that, dropping flaps to 30. The cockpit buzzed with motion as the systems responded. Flaps extending, gear deploying, the sound of the aircraft preparing to touch Earth once more. You ready for this? Kevin asked, eyes locked on the approach. Lily didn't hesitate. I've been ready since I stepped in here. As they began their descent, the ground rushing up to meet them, Kevin felt a strange clarity settle over him. Whatever happened next, he wasn't flying alone. He wasn't carrying the weight of 200 lives by himself anymore. Lily was there, his second wing. The storm had tested them, but it hadn't broken them, and now it was time to land, together. The runway stretched ahead like a lifeline drawn across the earth, narrow, cracked at the edges, but steady. It wasn't a commercial landing strip with layered safety nets and full lighting systems. It was military grade, brutal in its simplicity and utterly unforgiving. Kevin squinted through the windshield, gauging wind shear and descent rate, his knuckles whitening on the yoke. His voice was low but calm. Gear down, flaps full, throttle to 60. Beside him, Lily responded without missing a beat. Gear confirmed, wind holding steady from the northwest. You're on the path. Her voice was clear, steady, unshaken by altitude or speed, and it grounded him more than the runway ever could. The nose of the aircraft dipped incrementally, and the entire fuselage responded like a living creature finally submitting to gravity's call. Inside the cabin, passengers fell silent, each one suspended between fear and faith. Some gripping the armrests with white-knuckled desperation, others closing their eyes as if trying to will the plane toward the ground. One woman clutched a rosary. A child whispered into a stuffed bear's ear. No one spoke above a whisper, because even without knowing the full story, they sensed something extraordinary was happening just beyond the closed cockpit door. Kevin's gaze remained fixed on the strip, every fiber of his training activated, every memory from flight school flooding back like ghosts. But this wasn't a simulator. There were no second tries. One mistake, and the plane would overshoot or collapse on impact. The storm had broken, but the threat hadn't passed. And while adrenaline surged through his veins, it was Lily's voice that cut through the haze, anchoring him. Left drift, 2 degrees. Adjust pitch slightly. Nose up, just a touch. He obeyed instantly, not questioning her judgment, because over the past half hour she had proven something few ever could. Her instincts could be trusted. At 500 feet, the plane began to tremble. Not violently, but just enough to raise hairs along the arms of those paying attention. Kevin compensated with micro-adjustments, his breath held, his body taut with tension. "We're coming in hot," he muttered. Too late to change approach. "We ride this one down." "You can do this," Lily said, her hand hovering near the console, ready to assist but never interfering. "We're aligned. Let the plane settle. Don't force it." The runway loomed larger now, each second stretching long and thin like glass about to snap. Below them, the ground crew stood by in orange vests, motionless shadows beside flashing vehicles. Emergency responders lined the edges, eyes wide, breaths held. At 200 feet, the descent smoothed. The landing gear groaned under pressure, straining against speed and gravity. Kevin eased the throttle back further, guiding the aircraft like a whisper, coaxing it down instead of commanding it. At 100 feet, time seemed to slow. The world narrowed to the hum of engines, the rustle of wind, and the strip of asphalt, rising fast to meet them. Then, impact. A jolt ran through the cabin, throwing some passengers forward, followed by a bounce that lifted the aircraft briefly back into the air. Kevin didn't flinch. He held the yoke firm, adjusted trim, and let gravity take its course. A second impact, less violent. A skid. Tires screaming against the pavement. The aircraft tilted slightly left, and for a breathless moment, it felt like it might veer off, but Lily called it just in time. Right correction, 1.5 degrees. Kevin shifted the rudder, recentered. The nose aligned, the wheels gripped, the plane steadied. And then, silence. The engines roared down to idle, the motion slowed, and the aircraft rolled to a shaky but complete stop near the edge of the airstrip. For a full 5 seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire world waited for confirmation that this impossible landing had happened. Kevin exhaled, like he hadn't taken a breath in hours. His hands trembled on the yoke. He turned slowly toward Lily, who was already leaning back in her seat, finally letting the weight drop from her shoulders. "We're down," he said, his voice hoarse. Lily gave him a tired smile. "Told you we could fly through it." The intercom light blinked softly, a pulse in the dim cockpit. Kevin pressed the button, his voice projecting through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is co-pilot Kevin Blake. We've made an emergency landing. The aircraft is secure. And it wasn't just me. We were guided safely by someone who's not technically part of the flight crew, but today, she was our second wing." Applause erupted, tentative at first, then rising, wave after wave of claps and cheers and tears. Some passengers sobbed openly, others laughed in relief, their bodies trembling from released tension. Through the window in the cockpit door, Kevin saw heads turn, people craning to see who he was talking about. When Lily stepped into view, still in her uniform, her blonde hair slightly mussed but her gaze composed, the applause reached a thunderous pitch. A man near the front called out, "She flew the damn plane!" And others joined in, chanting her name as if willing the impossible into fact. Kevin rose from his seat, shoulders heavy but proud. The paramedics approached the cockpit. Captain Hart, who had begun stirring in the last few minutes, was still groggy but upright, blinking in confused awe as he looked at Lily. "Who?" he whispered. Kevin answered for him. "She saved your ship, Captain." And as the emergency doors opened and sunlight spilled into the cabin, Lily stepped back, letting Kevin take the lead in coordinating the evacuation. She wasn't interested in praise. She wasn't chasing recognition. She had done what needed to be done. And that, Kevin realized, was what made her extraordinary. As the last passengers disembarked and emergency crews secured the area, Lily walked slowly toward the edge of the strip, her hands clasped behind her back. Kevin followed. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her, watching the sun climb higher above the horizon. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't think they'd believe it," Kevin smiled faintly. "They don't have to. We were there." And somewhere deep inside that quiet morning air, between two strangers forged by fire and fear, something fragile and powerful began to take shape. Something not yet spoken aloud, but waiting to fly. The applause had barely faded when the headlines erupted. Flight attendant lands passenger jet in miracle emergency. Unknown. Hero saves hundreds at 10,000 feet. Flight 747 miracle. The co-pilot wasn't alone. Within hours, Lily Morgan's name was trending across every platform, splashed across breaking news tickers, blogs, and aviation forums alike. Her photo, taken from a blurred, shaky phone video recorded as she stepped out of the cockpit, circulated with breathless urgency. Journalists called her brave, brilliant, impossible. News anchors replayed the footage of Kevin's announcement, looping his words like a chorus. We were guided safely by someone who's not technically part of the flight crew, but today, she was our second wing. But not everyone cheered. At first, Lily tried to stay away from the noise. She ignored the pings on her phone, the messages from strangers, the sudden camera crews staking out the airline's employee entrance. She spent the first 2 nights after the landing in near silence, curled up on her couch, lights off, windows shut, her phone vibrating on the kitchen counter. Kevin had texted, just one word. Safe? She replied with, home. That was all. But even behind drawn curtains, the outside world found its way in. A man from a news station left a card in her mailbox. Another followed her on her morning run. A local newspaper published an article titled, Hero or Hazard? The praise was no longer unanimous. Questions began to swirl, subtle at first, then sharp. Was she qualified? Did she break protocol? Was she trained or lucky? Kevin tried to shield her from it. He answered the airline's questions honestly, filled out the incident reports, and spoke firmly with the Flight Operations Committee. But there were things even he couldn't block. A popular morning show ran a segment debating whether Lily's actions were commendable or reckless heroism. One commentator scoffed, "So what now? Every flight attendant thinks they can fly a plane?" Lily saw the clip by accident, caught in a coffee shop while waiting for takeout. She stood there, face frozen, hands trembling slightly, then left without her order. That night, she didn't sleep. She paced. She thought about what she should have done differently. She wondered, briefly, shamefully, if maybe she had overstepped. By the end of the week, the conversation had shifted from celebration to scrutiny. Airline regulators made vague statements about unauthorized cockpit access, and online forums exploded with speculation. Some people called for Lily to be honored with an award. Others demanded she be fired. The balance tipped back and forth like a plane caught in crosswinds, and Lily stood at the center of it, utterly unprepared for the way the world dissected her every move. Kevin visited on the 4th day. She didn't answer the door, but he waited anyway, leaning against the wall of her apartment building until she finally let him in. She looked pale, thinner than before, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "They're saying I was irresponsible," she said quietly. "That I endangered people." Kevin didn't try to argue. He simply stepped forward, held her hands, and said, "You saved lives. That's the only fact that matters." But even Kevin's presence couldn't hold back the tidal wave that was forming. A leaked report from an internal meeting used the phrase, breach of cockpit protocol. And suddenly, the narrative had teeth. On social media, anonymous profiles spread doubts. If she had failed, would she be a hero or a felon? A pilots' union issued a carefully worded statement, reminding the public that only certified personnel were allowed to operate flight controls. Lily, reading those words on her laptop, felt something inside her cave. Not from guilt, but from exhaustion. She had walked into that cockpit because she had to, because no one else could. But now, it felt like the world had forgotten the chaos. They only remembered the rules she broke to save them. The worst moment came quietly, in her kitchen, when she found her hands trembling too hard to hold a glass. Kevin was there again, sitting at her table, watching her from across the room. She didn't speak, not right away. When she did, her voice cracked. Maybe I should have let the plane go down. Kevin's face went rigid. Don't you dare say that, he snapped. Don't ever say that again. His tone wasn't angry. It was hurt, deep and guttural. I watched you step into fire, Lily. I watched you take control when I froze. I owe you my life. We all do. She looked at him, blinking rapidly, but didn't argue. She couldn't. The final blow came 2 days later. A press briefing. An airline spokesperson stood stiffly at a podium and answered questions about investigations into procedural conduct during Flight 747. They refused to say Lily's name, only referring to her as a non-flight crew individual. That night, the storm in Lily broke. She stood in her living room, voice rising for the first time in days. They're erasing me, she shouted, pacing the floor, fists clenched. They're rewriting what happened because I wasn't supposed to matter. Kevin didn't try to calm her. He let her yell, let her cry. When she collapsed into a chair, shaking and breathless, he knelt in front of her and spoke gently, but with steel in his voice. Then let me remind them. The next morning, he was gone. Lily woke up to silence, the front door locked, his jacket missing from the hook. She thought he had left, for good. But then she turned on the TV. There he was, Kevin Blake, live on national broadcast, standing in front of reporters, uniform pressed, voice clear and unwavering. She didn't land the plane alone, he said, but I wouldn't have landed it without her. He looked directly into the camera. Lily Morgan didn't act out of ego or recklessness. She acted with precision, skill, and courage. She didn't overstep. She stepped up. And we're alive because of it. The feed cut. Lily stood in her living room, frozen. Her heart thundered. Her eyes burned. She whispered to no one, "You idiot." Then finally, she smiled. A small, broken, grateful thing. Outside, her phone began to buzz again, not with blame this time, but with something closer to justice. The winds were shifting, and the woman they tried to silence was rising again, carried by the only truth that mattered. She had done the right thing, and someone had finally said it out loud. The studio lights were unforgiving, bright, sterile, and mercilessly hot. Kevin stood at the podium in his crisp uniform. The weight of the moment pressing into his spine like gravity had increased tenfold. Reporters filled every seat. Cameras rolled from every angle. And behind him, the airline's logo glowed faintly on the navy blue backdrop. But Kevin wasn't here as a representative of the airline. He wasn't here as a co-pilot with a rehearsed statement. He was here as a witness, as a man who had looked death in the eye and survived because of her. And now, he wasn't going to let the silence swallow her story. When the lead journalist cleared her throat and asked, "Can you clarify the role of the non-crew member who entered the cockpit during the emergency?" Kevin didn't flinch. He looked straight into the lens, shoulders square, voice calm. "Yes," he said. "Her name is Lily Morgan. She's a flight attendant with no formal pilot's license, but on the night of the emergency, she became the reason anyone is here to ask questions." The room rustled, some reporters whispering, others typing frantically. Kevin continued, not waiting for permission. "When the captain went unconscious and our controls failed, I froze. I won't sugarcoat that. My training was there, but fear had overtaken it. Lily stepped in. She didn't ask to take over. She didn't need to. She saw what was needed and moved." He paced slightly, not out of nerves but conviction. "She understood the systems better than most cadets I've trained with. She assessed the situation, communicated with clarity, and directed flight corrections that stabilized the aircraft. Every decision she made was grounded in knowledge, not instinct alone. And while I had my hands on the controls, it was her mind that guided them. I was in her hands." "That's the truth." Another voice chimed in, sharper, more skeptical. "But, Mr. Blake, there are concerns. She entered the cockpit without clearance. Doesn't that constitute a security violation? Kevin didn't blink. You can quote me. If breaking protocol means saving 200 lives, then maybe the protocol needs adjusting. A silence settled in the room, thick and heavy, before Kevin added, "She didn't do this for attention. She's been hiding in her apartment for days because you've turned her miracle into a scandal. She didn't ask for fame. She didn't even ask for thanks. But she deserves to be seen." He stepped back, not waiting for applause or further questioning. The press conference ended, not with a bang, but with a hush, a rare collective pause, as if the room had forgotten how to respond to honesty. Back in her apartment, Lily watched the entire thing alone, barefoot in an oversized hoodie, standing in the middle of her living room, like the floor might vanish beneath her. When Kevin spoke her name, her breath caught. When he said he had frozen, her knees nearly buckled. And when he said she had saved them, she felt something inside her finally unlock. Her hand went to her mouth, covering a sob that wasn't sadness, but relief. It had all happened so fast. The flight, the landing, and the noise that came after. But in that moment, with his voice echoing through the screen, she was finally allowed to breathe. Later that night, her phone lit up like a city skyline, messages flooding in from colleagues, strangers, even passengers from the flight. One woman wrote, "You held my baby's life in your hands. Thank you." Another read, "They tried to make you small, but you're the biggest damn reason we're alive." Hashtags began to trend. "Thank you, Lily." "Second wing." "Leatherfly." The tone had shifted. The world had tilted again, but this time in her favor. The vitriol faded, replaced by gratitude and awe, as if Kevin's words had reminded people that sometimes the truth doesn't need defense. It just needs to be spoken. The next evening, a soft knock came at her door. Lily opened it to find Kevin standing there, not in uniform, not in armor, but in a simple t-shirt and jeans, holding nothing but his hands in his pockets and that same quiet look in his eyes. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She stepped aside and he walked in. They sat on her couch without ceremony, a steaming mug between them, the silence not awkward, but familiar. Earned. Finally, she asked, "Why did you do it? Go public?" Kevin shrugged, his voice low. "Because you weren't going to, and because I couldn't live with the version of the story where you're left out." Lily looked at him for a long time, not with suspicion or guardedness, but with something new, something soft. "You said I guided you," she murmured. Kevin smiled faintly. "You did. And I'll follow you again if it ever comes to that." She leaned back, exhaling deeply, then whispered, "It was never about saving a plane." He nodded. "No, it was about saving each other." Outside, the world continued spinning. News cycles updated, headlines faded. But inside that small apartment, a kind of peace had settled. One not built on applause or permission, but on truth, spoken, heard, believed. And as the night grew darker and the world quieter, Kevin remained there, not out of duty, but choice. The storm had passed, but something stronger remained in its wake. Something real. Something that, for the first time, neither of them felt the need to run from. In the days that followed Kevin's broadcast, the world didn't exactly forget, but it did move on. Headlines shifted to politics, celebrity drama, and weather disasters. The frenzy around Flight 747 dimmed, reduced to a few lingering interviews and the occasional blog post praising the woman who wasn't supposed to save us. For Lily, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was healing. Without the pressure of defending herself or hiding behind her apartment door, she began to live again, not loudly, but with quiet intent. And Kevin, true to form, didn't vanish after the cameras turned away. He remained, unofficially steadily, without demanding space or explanation. It started with small things: a knock on her door, a bag of groceries in his hand, some excuse about needing to use her oven because his was temperamental. A leaky kitchen faucet she hadn't gotten around to fixing, suddenly repaired. Her cat's broken window perch, replaced with a sturdier, handmade version. Kevin never asked to stay. He never assumed. But his presence became rhythm, familiar, woven into the fabric of her space like he had always belonged there, even though they never said it aloud. And Lily, who had spent years guarding her solitude like a fortress, found herself adjusting the lock on her front door to accommodate a second key. They talked, sometimes deeply, sometimes not at all. They argued over music, over whether pineapple belonged on pizza. Kevin insisted it did, over who left the lights on in the hallway. But their conversations never splintered. They stretched and retracted like breath, imperfect, human, real. Lily told him about her past, slowly, piece by piece. About how she had trained for air traffic control before switching paths. How her parents had dismissed her passion for engineering as a phase. She had dropped out of her final certification because she'd grown tired of proving herself to people who never wanted to see her in the cockpit. Kevin listened. Not like someone who wanted to fix her, but like someone who needed to understand her. He offered no solution, just companionship. And in return, Lily found herself asking about his late father, about the pressure of legacy, about how his older brother always outshone him at family dinners. They didn't fall in love all at once. It was slower than that, quieter than fiction allows. It wasn't a kiss under moonlight or a grand confession during a thunderstorm. It was a Wednesday night, her hair tied up, him stirring pasta, while she laughed at something stupid he said. It was 2 cups of tea and no words spoken because none were needed. It was brushing past each other in a narrow hallway, and neither of them stepped aside, just standing there for a second too long. People began to notice. A neighbor nodded knowingly when Kevin walked out of Lily's building at 6:30 a.m., his jacket slung over one shoulder. A flight attendant at work raised an eyebrow when Lily smiled at her phone after a message. Her manager teased her about the co-pilot who never really left. But Lily didn't correct them. She didn't define what they were. She didn't need to. Because whatever they were becoming, it wasn't fragile. It was earned. Then one night, something shifted. Lily came home late, exhausted, her heels in one hand, a thunderstorm painting the windows with streaks of rain. Kevin was already there, reading on the couch, his feet up, her cat curled against his leg. He looked up, saw the weight on her face, and didn't ask questions. He stood, walked to the kitchen and started boiling water for tea. Lily sat on the floor, back against the wall, letting the rain echo through the apartment. When he handed her the cup, she didn't take it. Instead, she whispered, "I wasn't always this guarded." Kevin crouched beside her, resting his arm on his knee. "I don't think you're guarded," he said softly. "I think you're careful with things that matter." She turned to him, eyes tired but open. "After the flight, I realized how quickly everything can break. I built walls because I needed to know what would hold." He didn't argue. He didn't offer empty reassurance. He just nodded. "And if I stay, what happens when I become one of those things?" She didn't answer at first. But then she reached out, placed her hand on his and said, "Then I guess we test the structure together." After that night, something invisible shifted between them. Kevin began staying over more often, not just for convenience, but because home had started to mean her couch, her kitchen, her quiet smile in the morning light. He learned how she liked her coffee. She learned how he hummed old rock songs while shaving. They didn't move in together, not officially, but his toothbrush found a permanent place beside hers. And on Sundays, they went grocery shopping like people who had always shared the same list. One afternoon, Lily opened her mailbox and found a small envelope from the airline. Inside was a thank you card. No policy updates, no apologies. Just a single sentence, handwritten by the CEO. "We got it wrong. Thank you for proving us right." She held it for a long time, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Kevin, seeing it, only smiled. "Framed or fridge?" She answered without hesitation. "Fridge. Where the real stuff goes." Outside, the world remained noisy. Planes still took off. Protocols still existed. But in one corner of the city, in a small apartment that had weathered its kind of turbulence, two people who had once been strangers now shared groceries, glances, and the quiet certainty that something real had survived the fall. They weren't a couple. Not officially, not yet. But they were something rooted, something growing. Almost a family. Almost. Autumn arrived softly that year, brushing the city in shades of copper and gold, the kind of weather that made the air feel lighter, as if it too were finally exhaling. Lily stood by her window, watching leaves drift lazily past the glass, a mug of cinnamon tea warming her hands. And for once, she wasn't thinking about what came next. She wasn't calculating consequences or rehearsing possible futures. She was simply existing, quietly, fully, in a moment that didn't require defense. Behind her, Kevin's jacket lay draped over the back of her dining chair. His keys sat in a small dish beside hers. Their lives had never been formally merged, but they'd long since stopped separating. Kevin had been offered a promotion, a long-haul international route that would have taken him across oceans for weeks at a time. When he brought it up, he hadn't framed it as a celebration. He'd just said, "It's on the table, but so is this." By this, he'd meant her apartment, her routines, her quiet Sunday mornings. He meant the way he didn't feel hollow when he was near her. Lily hadn't responded with a grand gesture or an emotional plea. She'd simply placed her hand on his and said, "You don't need to choose, just don't disappear." And he hadn't. He'd turned down the route. Not because he was afraid to go, but because for the first time, he had something worth staying for. Their lives fell into a rhythm, unspoken but sure. Tuesday dinners, Saturday morning walks, evenings spent curled on the couch, not always touching, but close enough to feel each other's presence. It was easy to forget how they had started, through emergency and fear, through a cockpit lit in red and systems on the verge of collapse. Sometimes, Lily would wake in the night, the memory of alarms and falling altitude clinging to her skin like sweat, and Kevin would reach out, wordless, anchoring her with a hand on her back, a heartbeat pressed close. Other nights, he dreamed of the moment he'd frozen, the shame of his own silence, and she'd whisper into his shoulder, "You didn't fail. You survived." One golden afternoon, they found themselves at the park, lying side by side on a worn picnic blanket, their backs to the grass and their eyes to the sky. Around them, children flew paper planes, laughing as they raced across the field. A little girl with curly hair and paint-streaked cheeks approached them with a crooked, hand-folded plane. "Want to fly it?" she asked, holding it out. Kevin took it gently, his fingers brushing Lily's, and with a quick flick of his wrist, sent it soaring. It caught a breeze and climbed, spinning and dipping before landing gracefully at their feet. The girl squealed with delight and ran off. Kevin watched her go, then turned to Lily. "You ever think," he said, "that all of this started because you walked through the wrong door?" Lily smiled, her lashes casting shadows over her cheeks. "It wasn't the wrong door," she said. "It was the only one open." He shifted onto his elbow, gazing down at her. There was no urgency in his expression, no dramatic tension, just quiet certainty, the kind that grows when two people stop pretending they're still afraid to fall. "Then, maybe it's time we open another one." Lily's breath caught, not from fear, but from the clarity of what he meant. He didn't pull out a ring. He didn't kneel. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver key, one that matched hers. "I rented the place across the hall," he said. "But I figure maybe we just share one." She took the key with trembling fingers, stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at him. "You didn't need to ask," Kevin smiled, the kind of smile that reaches the corners of the eyes, soft and whole. "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." They stayed there until the sun dipped low, casting long shadows that melted into each other. No ceremony, no applause. Just two people who had once steadied an aircraft are now learning how to steady each other. That evening, Kevin made dinner, burned the garlic, overcooked the pasta, and Lily ate every bite without complaint. They danced in the kitchen afterward, barefoot and ridiculous, to a song neither of them remembered choosing. And when he spun her clumsily, she laughed so hard she had to hold the counter for support. "We're a disaster," she said, breathless. "Yeah," Kevin replied, pulling her into his arms. "But we land well." In the weeks that followed, life continued its quiet march forward. Lily received an invitation to speak at an aviation symposium, not about heroism, but about preparedness, systems, and what it means to think clearly under pressure. She accepted. Kevin started teaching part-time at a flight school nearby, coaching young pilots not just in technical skill, but in how to stay human in the sky. They weren't chasing headlines. They were building something ordinary, honest, real. One morning, as they sat by the window watching rain streak down the glass, Lily rested her head against Kevin's shoulder and whispered, "I think I finally get it." He tilted his head slightly, brushing her hair aside. "Get what?" She smiled softly. "We didn't just land a plane, we landed somewhere else. Somewhere we didn't know we needed." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. He just wrapped his arm around her and pulled her closer. And as the rain kept falling, and the city moved on, two people who met in the sky stayed grounded together. Not because they were fearless, or flawless, or fated, but because when everything else fell away, they'd found the one place they could always return to: each other, their softest, safest landing. If this story touched your heart even just a little, I'd love to hear what part stayed with you the most. Was it the courage in the cockpit, the quiet bond that grew afterward, or the simple beauty of choosing to stay? Share your thoughts in the comments, even if it's just a number from 0 to 10. Thank you for joining me on this journey through fear, connection, and finding home in another person. Until next time, take care, stay grounded, and never stop believing in the quiet power of ordinary heroes.